My parents had a house set in a hollow, surrounded by tons of hills and forests. Although I used to spend a lot of time exploring those hills, each time I would find new places, and it was especially great during the fall. When I was 12, I went out for a good adventure. It was quite brisk outside, so I made sure to put on a jacket. The leaves had already turned for the fall, and the countryside was absolutely beautiful. I got started pretty early in the afternoon because it got dark quite quickly, and I didn't want to be caught in the woods in the dark. I had been hiking for a few hours through the forest when I began going downhill. At the very bottom of this hill, there was a huge, treeless field. I had never seen it before, and I was really fascinated. Even more interesting was the huge, dilapidated barn I saw sitting in the middle of this field. Finding abandoned barns out in the hills wasn't unheard of, but this one was enormous. Easily the biggest barn I'd ever seen in my entire life. Excited, I headed down towards it. I noticed that the sun had descended a bit in the sky, and I cursed at myself for not leaving the house earlier. As it was, no matter how little time I spent exploring the barn, it would be quite dark by the time I got home. I figured it would be worth it though. While I didn't expect to find anything interesting inside the barn, it was still a bit of an adventure for me. I didn't realize exactly how huge this thing was until I was actually standing right outside of it. It was easily as tall as a 5-story building, and the boards were old, with the entire building graying and weathered down pretty badly. Though I stood in front of the huge doors, which looked fairly solid as well, I wasn't even sure if I was going to be able to open them. I looked around, starting to get slightly nervous that someone who owned the land the barn was on might be around. I would have been able to see if anyone was, though the barn likely had been empty for years, maybe decades by the look of it. It seemed there wasn't much for me to be afraid of, however. Tell that to a 12-year-old boy trying to explore with an active and vivid imagination. Summoning some courage, I opened the door, which wasn't locked. I pulled it open just enough for me to slip inside. Once I got in, it was even more awesome than I thought. The interior of this barn was wide open and plain enormous. There were many different lofts, which were accessible by trapdoors and ladders, and hay was everywhere. Tons of tools, such as pitchforks and sickles, hung on the walls. I searched around and felt like this was the coolest place I had ever been. After looking around for a bit, I found something else that was even cooler. As I was walking around, my foot slapped against something underneath the hay. When I brushed the hay to the side, I noticed my foot had hit the handle of a trapdoor. This was very exciting. I proceeded to clear the hay off the door and then tried to open it. It took a bit of effort, but when I did get it open, I stood there in shock. In the room under this door, there were 3 people. 3 skinny, naked people. They weren't just skinny, they were emaciated. When they saw me, 2 of them began to hiss at me. The third one, with pure hate and anger reflected in his eyes, growled at me and then screamed, "Close the door!" I wasn't able to move at first. I was so utterly shocked I didn't know what to do. I stood there like an idiot, holding that trapdoor. The 2 people who had hissed at me first sank deeper into the darkness of the hole, but the third one, the angry one, sneered. He bolted over on all 4s, and when he got to the ladder, he began to climb it at an alarming speed. I didn't even have time to close the damn door. I freaked out and took off from the entrance of the barn. Looking back as I was getting out, the third person had actually gotten out of the room and closed the door. He came running after me. My 12-year-old legs had never run faster before or since. I squeezed out and began running through the woods. Although it wasn't dark outside yet, the sun had gone down enough that it wasn't very bright. I looked back a couple of times before I got to the trees and saw the guy running on all 4s straight at me. Once I got back to the trees, I didn't waste any more time looking back. It got completely dark long before I got home. It was a nightmare going through the forest in the dark, hearing that person still out there. Every sound I heard, every crunched leaf, every snapping twig, I jumped and felt like I was being followed. When I got back to my house, I climbed over the barbed wire fence and into my yard. Once there, I booked it until I got in the door, and then I locked it. I told my parents everything I had seen, but they really didn't believe me. My mom just told me I needed to stop making up stories. My dad told me that even if I really had seen such a thing, I had no business going into the barn to begin with. Obviously, the people weren't being held there against their will, he said. A lot of weird stuff happens out in the woods, and it was best if I just forget about things like that. But how could I forget about it? When I went to sleep in my room that night, My eyes were focused on my window, expecting to look up and see that person looking in at me, his eyes inflamed with rage and hate. Whenever I was in those woods, I felt like I was being watched all the time, so don't ever go into an abandoned building. Many neighborhoods have what you could call haunted houses in them. You know the exact kind I mean. Houses that are abandoned and boarded up for some reason, and no one really seems to know why. So, all the children just decided the house must be haunted or something. The older kids make up weird stories about it just to scare their siblings and friends. It's always just a bunch of nonsense. But it becomes a legend among the kids in the neighborhood. In my neighborhood, we had something even better than that. We had this old abandoned hospital. That's all I really knew about it. It had been abandoned for a very long time. The kids in the neighborhood all claimed it was a mental hospital, but I never really verified that for sure. We had this little town legend about it, at least amongst us kids. So, the story went that this was a mental hospital, but when they closed it down, the patients were released back into society. One of the patients, a man the kids called Lucky, not the cleverest nickname, but we were kids after all, considered the place to be his home. He returned to living in it years afterward. Supposedly, this man lived in the basement and would try to kill anyone who ever entered his home. The kids in the neighborhood would always dare each other to break in and spend time in that old hospital, but no one would ever actually do it. I'd been dared before myself, and the closest I'd ever gotten was climbing over the gate once. However, I'm not too proud to admit that I chickened out immediately and hopped back over. There was one kid in the neighborhood who did take the dare completely, so this story is not a first-hand account of what happened inside. It almost scared me to death, not knowing what really happened to him. I was a high school freshman on Halloween when a bunch of us headed down to the hospital to do the usual daring. Some of us would go right up to the gate, begin to climb over, and then chicken out right away. One kid, though I didn't really know him well, was named Mark. He was teasing us all mercilessly for being such cowards. He kept telling us that the stories of Lucky were just a bunch of baloney, and we were dumb for being so scared. About 6 of us had enough of his crap. We said, "Old chicken down," and we were being teased by this guy. We'd had enough, so we told Mark that unless he was willing to put his money where his mouth was, he needed to shut the hell up. We were wrong in assuming that Mark was going to chicken out like us, though he readily accepted our challenge and began to climb over the gate. He climbed over easily and jumped down on the other side. Then he waved at us and walked over to the hospital's door. He actually tried to open the door as well. That was more than any of us had ever done before. It didn't work though, as the door was locked. This actually gave Mark the chance to back out, but he didn't. After looking around for a bit, he found a large rock and used it to shatter one of the windows. We all got worried, of course. We thought the noise would attract somebody to the site, but that didn't happen. Tom broke the glass out of the basement window and then carefully lowered himself inside and out of sight. We were all pretty shocked at this point and a bit ashamed of ourselves as well. The shame that we felt, though, in no way compared to the paranoia that settled in on us as we waited for Mark to come back out. At first, we were just impressed he'd even gone in. Then we were more impressed. As the hours passed and Mark still did not come back out of the hospital, the initial feeling of being impressed began to fade into worry. The longer he stayed inside, the more concerned we became. After an hour had passed, it was bad enough. Even worse when 2 hours had passed, and absolutely dreadful when nearly 4 hours had gone by without a single peep from Mark. It really began to bug us. We weren't sure why he hadn't come back out yet, but we were definitely speculating on it. Our first thought was that he was taking his time to try and scare us. The worst thought, and the one that became more and more realistic to us kids as time went on, was that Mark must have really come across Lucky, and he must have been unhappy to have someone invading his home. Mark's disappearance put us all in a bad place. We weren't supposed to be hanging out there, and if he didn't come back, we were going to have to go to our parents or the police, and neither of those choices were going to be easy. When Mark still didn't emerge after 6 hours, we went directly to the police. Maybe we should have gone to our parents first in hindsight, because when the cops called our parents out of the blue, the situation got even worse. I got chewed out in front of all the cops and all the other parents as well. While the chewing out was quite bad, what happened when the cops went to the hospital to look for Mark was much worse. The police searched the entirety of the property, the basement, the rooms, the hallways, everything. There was not a single trace of Mark or anybody else. The police figured he must have exited the building somewhere else and left us waiting on the outside for him. Although Mark still hadn't returned home yet, the police told his parents he was probably just playing out this prank. But Mark didn't return that night, nor did he return the next day or the next week. Search parties looked for him throughout the town, but he wasn't there. The hospital was searched more than once and nothing was found. No Mark, no Lucky, no indication other than the broken window that anybody had ever been there at all. Posters with Mark's picture were put up in the post office and in stores, but he never showed up. This happened in the 70s, and to this day, I have no idea what happened that night. Mark was never found, and the guilt I felt throughout the years is pretty bad, but not nearly as bad as the wondering. I never saw Mark again, and I don't know what happened to him when he went into that abandoned hospital. There was an old abandoned cat shelter just outside of town. It had garnered quite a reputation concerning why it was closed down. The prevailing but ludicrous theory was that they had allowed a stray cat in there, which had some sort of rare flesh-eating disease they weren't able to screen for. Consequently, they couldn't detect it before putting it in with all the other cats, leading to the demise of the other cats. The shelter lost all its funding as a result and was forced to shut down. Some people even claimed that there were tons of dead cat bodies in the building because they hadn't bothered to clean it out before they left. Obviously, that story was made up so far over the top that no one with half a brain would ever believe it. However, it did lend an air of mystery and foreboding about this abandoned building. I myself used to be really curious about this shelter and wanted to go in and see what it was like inside. I knew it would probably just be boring, but I wouldn't know for sure unless I checked it out first. I myself used to be really curious about this shelter and wanted to go in and see what it was like inside. I knew it would probably just be boring, but I wouldn't know for sure unless I checked it out first. One night, I finally worked up the nerve to break into the building. I had to wait until it was around midnight because I didn't want to worry about being seen by other people. It was creepy approaching this building in the dark, but I did have a flashlight with me. I searched around quite a bit, but eventually I found a broken window at the back of the building to climb into. This was convenient, as I didn't really want to cause any more damage to this building. The last thing I needed was a vandalism charge for an old, broken, run-down building. Once I got inside, I began to search around in the various rooms. Much like I had originally expected, the shelter was not as interesting in reality as it was in theory. There was a lot of old furniture, some shelves, and documents, but there were no bodies of dead cats lying strewn about. There wasn't anything that indicated in any way why the place had closed down. It was just an old broken down building. As I was exploring though, I heard a noise coming from down the hallway. Looking down from that direction, I could see it was coming from a room that seemed to be a huge cat play room. They had a big cat tree, and it was closed off by a screen. I was curious, perhaps a cat or some other sort of animal had snuck in there. I wanted to check this out, so I entered the area around the screen and shone my flashlight all over the area, not really seeing much of anything at first. I then saw something moving underneath the cat tree. I shone my light on it. It looked like a blanket with something moving under. I moved closer to the screen, figuring I was safe. Whatever I was looking at was way in the middle of the play area, but definitely something was moving. I kept looking at it, trying to figure out what was going on. It was then that I noticed a blanket being pulled slightly to the side and saw someone's eyes peeking out at me. He looked directly into the flashlight. He probably wasn't able to make up much about me, but as soon as he saw me, he pulled the blanket down and glared at me. He screamed, "Stay away from my kitties!" He got up and threw the blanket to the side. The man ran up to the screen, causing me to step back and trip in shock. I fell right on my ass. The man pressed his face against the screen and began to chew on the mesh. He screamed, "Leave my kitties alone!" I could see him slobbering all over as he pressed his face up against it. It was then I noticed he was holding what looked like the dead body of an animal, which I assumed to be a cat. One hand was vigorously petting it as he yelled at me and gnashed at the screen. It was hard to tell what was going on, but I didn't want to wait around to find out. He didn't seem like he wanted to kill me or anything, but I didn't want to take the chance and find out what he did want to do. I jumped off my ass and took off running out the door. As I ran back to the window I had crawled into, I could hear the man yelling at me, telling me to leave his kittens alone. It was freaky. I heard the man's voice clearly behind me, even as I was crawling out through the window. After I got out, I could hear him screaming and crying and howling. I ran as far away from that place as I could. I suppose the experience wasn't life-alteringly scary, but it was pretty creepy in the moment when it happened. The man was obviously disturbed, and that was the worst part of it. It was nice to know that the animal shelter was simply an abandoned building. I figured the guy was a homeless man who moved in or something, but obviously he'd let the place get to him.